I only did it when the anathemas were lifted by the Moscow Patriarch at the urging of the famous writer Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn came before the Sobor of the Russian Church, Moscow Patriarch, in 1971, and basically said something to this effect: look, we are all in this great pain at being under the communist yoke for all these years, and we pray that God will release us from this yoke, but I don't think God is ever going to do this to us and forgive us until we repent of the thing that we did was even way worse, which we did to the old believers. So we have to repent of this and make peace with the old believers, and that's what led the Moscow Patriarchate to lift the anathemas against the old believers. Now I want you to hear the adapted. We're doing it in English, and you're going to see that basically we tried very hard to adapt it exactly the way it was in the Slavonic. I'll just give you an example of that. Just an example of that is the way we would sing Christos Voskres, Christ is risen here. It would sound like this in Slavonic. Christos Voskrese iz mертвых, смерти она смерть наступи, и гробным его отдарова. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life.
Sure. So first, just thank you for being here and talking with me. Yeah. So this is Father Pimen.
Father Pimen Simon, yes.
Pimen Simon from Erie, Pennsylvania. So if you don't mind, first just tell me about yourself and your parish. I would love to know a little bit more about the.
So I'm the rector of the Old Rite Orthodox Church of the Nativity of Christ. You know something, apparently you've indicated that. I don't want to get into a long history about the schism in the Russian Orthodox Church, but to make any sense of this, I've got to at least give you a little background, because you referred to priesthood old believers, priestless old believers. So when the Patriarch Nikon introduces the reforms of the ritual into the Russian Orthodox Church in approximately 1653, I guess I would say it begins with people who just oppose those reforms and what he's doing, especially because he did them on his own basis, and they felt they were ill-advised, and they were certainly earth-shattering if you're talking about ritual. To be taught all your life that particularly the meaning of the two-fingered sign of the cross, and then to go to the three-fingered sign of the cross, it led to a huge division in the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, the Patriarch Nikon was able to, in one way or another, convince all the other bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church, and it's nothing like now where there are hundreds of them. I don't know exactly what the number was, I think 12, 15 or something. But in one way or another, he convinced the bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church to follow him and to abide by the reforms he indicated. There was at least one bishop, Paul of Kolomna, who would not go along with those reforms. Patriarch Nikon had him imprisoned. He died in prison and really became a great hero for the Old Ritualists. So his main opponent was a man named Avakum. Avakum was the archpriest of the Kazan Cathedral in Moscow. It became like the story kind of Patriarch Nikon with the reforms and archpriest Avakum who opposed the reforms. So since the Orthodox Church is a hierarchical church, once all of the bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church accept the reforms of the Patriarch Nikon, even though over a period of time, and not a very long period of time, millions of Russian Orthodox oppose those reforms, they find themselves in a position going, what do we do now? Well, don't worry about it, because clearly this is going to be the end of the world. It was a very apocalyptic time through all of Europe, not only through Russia. So in the meantime, let's just really isolate ourselves in many instances, kind of go into communal places where men and women have no sexual relations and intimacy any longer, and we pray for the end of the world, and we simply wait for that to happen. When it doesn't happen by the end of the 17th century, the question becomes, uh-oh, what do we do? So a significant part of the old ritualists, the really old ritualists, the staroobryatsi, obryat in Russian means the ritual, so staroobryatsi means the old ritualists. They will pick up what I call the misnomer over a period of time, being known as staroveri by most people in Russian literature, meaning literally old believers, but in reality there's no difference in the belief of the old believers of the Russian Orthodox Church and all the other Orthodox Christians in the world. So, at least, let's say half and half, there are those who go, there's simply no priesthood left on the face of the earth. There's no hierarchy left. We're certainly not going to look to the Latins for a hierarchy. We believe they went into schism or heresy way back in the 11th century. And since the Greeks and the other Orthodox are the culprits, they're the ones who really caused Patriarch Nikon to introduce these reforms. We're not going to look to them, because if we don't think Patriarch Nikon's reforms are orthodox, we certainly don't think the people who led him into this are orthodox. So there's nothing we can do. Let's do this. The last ordained priest who was ordained before these reforms, before he dies, he'll give a blessing to some leader in the parish, and that leader in the parish will literally become the guide of the parish. He will be known as a nastavnik, N-A-S-T-I-V-N-I-K. The nastavnik will lead the prayers. In many places in the Russian Orthodox Church, because of the distance, it was not unusual for people to go for years with having reader services without a priest.
Hey, hit that like button.
And the reader services of the Russian Orthodox Church are really not that different than the prayer services you would have with a priest, particularly Vespers, Matins, Compline, midnight service hours. There's hardly any difference. Instead of saying, "For thine is the kingdom," after the Our Father, you'd say, "Lord Jesus." Anyway, you could do these services pretty well. In an emergency, anybody can baptize, so the nastavnik can baptize. In an emergency, anybody can hear a confession. He can at least hear it, so a nastavnik can hear it. So over a period of time, what happens is it becomes the norm for at least half of the old believers to go, this is all we can do. It's probably God understands. We're probably not worthy of the Eucharist any longer. And so the priestless old believers become very much not content, but realizing, okay, this is the way it is. This is the way it's been for hundreds of years. And after a while, don't even have any sense that something's missing. Now, there's another significant part of the old believers, however, who go, well, we can't live without the full sacramental life of the church. What are we going to do? So in the beginning, what they do is they convince many of the priests of the dominant government church, that is the church under the Patriarch and the Synod of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church, the post-Nikonian church, where old believers like to call them Nikonians, to, you really know the old rite's better than the new rite, and there's things being done in the new rite that probably you don't agree with. Why don't you just come over and be a priest for us? So they're able to find priests who will literally flee from the dominant church and become priests for the old believers. So you have a significant part, about half of the old believers, being priested old believers versus the priestless old believers. And around the beginning of the 19th century, the old believers are becoming very popular because much of what's happened in Russia in the 18th century, I taught Russian culture for many years in a university here, the westernization of Russian culture has been so vast that many of the Russians are really becoming disgusted with, let's say, the westernization and the control of the state over the church. So the old believers are really becoming more and more popular in Russia. The Tsar Nicholas I orders these priests who are going over to the old believers to stop, or he's going to have them suspended. When that happens, the old believers try to find some way they can reestablish a hierarchy, and they find a bishop in Turkey who had had his diocese taken away from him by the Ottoman Turks. They convince this Ambrose to become a bishop for them, and they take him to an area that's called Bela Crnitsa, which then was in Austria, now is in Romania, and they, in a sense, clean him up, confess him, have him then become a bishop for the Old Rite. When Tsar Nicholas I finds out about this, Tsar Nicholas I indicates to Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria, if you don't stop this, we're going to break off relations with you. And so Franz Joseph basically tells the Bela Crnitsa hierarchy, we're not going to tolerate this anymore, I'm going to stop this. And so Ambrose, the bishop of the Belokranitsa, immediately starts consecrating other bishops on his own, which is uncanonical and it's certainly an irregularity. So you have priested old believers who have a questionable canonicity, but recognize no one else in the world as being Orthodox except themselves. You have priestless old believers, still several million, nothing like before the Russian Revolution, but still several million, particularly located in northern Russia and the Baltic countries where they fled persecutions against the old believers. Again, there are several million people in who are old priestless old believers. I know that's a lot of stuff. My parish is a parish of priestless old believers. Our people primarily came from Western Russia, from the Pskov area of Russia, being persecuted in many ways. I mean, some of those persecutions literally were putting to death. Other ones were persecutions. You couldn't build a church, you couldn't publish, you couldn't ring bells, you could had a tax on beards and so forth. So the parish that we came from, our people emigrated to an area which is now northeastern Poland. It's an area in northeastern Poland known as Suwalki, Suwalki. Then it was, in a sense, under the Russian Empire, kind of an autonomous area where the Polish authorities had authority, but they were still kind of answerable to Russian authorities. So my parishioners were priestless old believers who went to Suwalki in the late 19th century, for whatever the reasons were. I like to think in the beginning it was romantic reasons that they were being persecuted or whatever the case is. Now, after all these years, I'm more akin to the idea that, like most Eastern European people particularly, the concept was, America's lined, the streets of America are lined with gold. Let's go to America. We'll have a much better life. And so our parishioners, priestless old believers, began immigrating to America, particularly either came to an area south of Pittsburgh, south of Washington, Pennsylvania, where a lot of them became coal miners, and the coal mines needed them, didn't care if they spoke English, or they located here in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is on the shore of Lake Erie, where there were pulp docks and ore docks and coal docks, and they could find work. Especially Irish business owners really were looking for employees. So this parish was particularly founded by those people. We continued to be priestless old believers throughout most of the 20th century. In the late third quarter of the 20th century, we had some problems in our parish. Our longtime nastavnik, mentor, minister, however you want to call him, although by this time they basically thought him as a priest, retired. We had some problems afterward. My parishioners begged me to take this position because I'd been involved since I was born. I went to a summer seminary. I became the nastavnik of the parish in 1976. But when I found out that the anathemas against the old believers had been lifted by the Moscow Patriarch in 1971 and by the church abroad, the church outside of Russia, the Zerobezhnaya Cerkov in 1974, I began to look at this posture like, well, since the anathemas are gone and they recognize the old rite as being orthodox and saving, is it possible we could follow that path? I won't get into the whole long story with that, but I went through a long process with my parish, educating them. And in July of 1983, after a long study of this issue and a vote of our parishioners, around 75 to 80% of our parishioners agreed that they would accept this idea of us uniting ourselves with the Russian Orthodox Church, which is run by the New Rite bishops, but with the guarantee that we would be always able to use the Old Rite, and we would never be forced with the New Rite. So we then became the only parish in the church outside of Russia using the Old Rite. Finally, what happened in the last several years was there was a Protestant group, kind of a sectarian Protestant group, that became aware of Orthodoxy. They became aware of us. The leader of that group decided he really wanted to be Orthodox and really wanted to be under the Old Rite, so he was ordained a priest. He's in southwestern Missouri. So there's an Old Rite parish then again united to the church outside of Russia. And then just a year ago, a couple of priested old believer priests up in Oregon and Alaska, where there are thousands of old believers, two of them came to the conclusion that they no longer wanted to be part of the Belokranitsa hierarchy, that is the hierarchy of priested old believers who recognize no other Orthodox in the world, and they also joined themselves to the church outside of Russia in this past January when they came to Erie actually and were chrismated and reordained to the orders by our Bishop John, who is one of the bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. His actual title is the Bishop of Caracas in South America, but he's also the protector of the Old Rite because he loves the Old Rite and really prefers the Old Rite. So there are now 4 parishes of Old Ritualists or Old Believers who are part of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. Of course, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia reunited itself with the Moscow Patriarchate in 2007, and so that makes us part of the larger Russian Orthodox Church in general. So sorry for that long thing, but in order to talk about anything else, you at least have to have some idea what does this mean.
No, that's great. That actually answered a fair number of questions. Is the majority of the Old Believers that exist today, are the majority of them priested or priestless?
I'd say half and half. And I would tell you, again, it's not I try to liken this to people to at least have some understanding. If you have understanding at all of what happened in Vatican II with the Roman Catholic Church, there's a similarity there. If you're an American and go, I don't get this, well, if you know anything about Vatican II and the reforms, you had significant portions, a significant minority of Roman Catholics who to this day do not like the reforms made in the Roman Catholic Church, and so, they go to Latin masses and so forth. That's kind of what happened in the Russian Orthodox Church. It's not that the Old Believers, Old Ritualists ever found themselves, totally changing. It was just, we don't want those reforms. Before the Revolution, there's very little doubt, and almost all scholars, that there were probably somewhere around 20 to 30 million Old Believers in Russia. So the numbers were not some insignificant, infinitesimal minority. Probably if the Old Believers were persecuted, maybe even more than any other, the Orthodox, because they were so staunchly anti-communist and staunchly against the government during the Soviet period. So I'm going to say that there's somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 1 to 2 million Old Believers left throughout the world. Again, primarily you'll find them in the northwest, in the northern part of Russia, particularly around the Moscow, St. Petersburg area, or mostly now I would say probably the largest centers of priestless Old Believers are in the Baltic countries, particularly in Lithuania and Latvia. The priesthood Old Believers are primarily more located in the Ural areas of Russia, although I shouldn't say that. They're probably all through Russia. So if there are 1 to 2 million Old Believers left in the world, I would say it's about half and half. There are Old Believer parishes now, again, significant communities up in Oregon and Alaska. I've been told, I haven't been up to Oregon a number of years, but I'm told there's probably maybe 5 to 10,000 of them up in the Oregon area, not anywhere near that in Alaska. And we were one of 4 parishes were called Pomorce priestless Old Believers. The other parishes that did not adopt English as we did in the early 1980s and priesthood have, for all intents and purposes, died out. So there's probably 100, 150 in our parish here. And then again, several thousand in either Oregon or up in Alaska. But again, probably at least a good million. There's a good number in Australia, good number in, some in the other parts of Europe and so forth. But primarily, I would say Australia, Northwest North America, and then through Russia, and particularly in the Baltic countries.
And you mentioned these 4 parishes that converted in a way, or they rejoined the Russian church,
rejoined.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
How many of all of the Old Ritualists have done that versus how many have not done that? Like, has that been a mass move?
Very few, but
in Russia
I think,
itself?
Yeah, very few, but I think it's a growing number. What happened was in the 1800s, the Empress Catherine really offered this in the first time. She offered and said, look, why don't you Old Believers rejoin the church? We'll allow you to use the old rite of the Russian Orthodox Church. But the Old Believers understood this was actually a kind of a subterfuge. It was, we'll allow you to do this, but eventually you'll wise up and follow what everybody else does, and you're going to be really limited, and we're not lifting the anathemas and the curses against the old rite. So it never took on tremendously, but I'm told that probably before the revolution, there were as many as 600 parishes in Russia that actually followed it. They became known as Yedinovertsie in Russian, which translates kind of loosely as one faith. So there was a significant amount. Again, they were highly persecuted during the Soviet period, so I'm told there's only 30 or 40 parishes like that in Russia. I would not have joined my church to the church outside of Russia under those circumstances. I only did it when the anathemas were lifted by the Moscow Patriarch at the urging of the famous writer Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn came before the Sobor of the Russian Church, Moscow Patriarch, in 1971, and basically said something to this effect: look, we are all in this great pain at being under the communist yoke for all these years, and we pray that God will release us from this yoke, but I don't think God is ever going to do this to us and forgive us until we repent of the thing that we did was even way worse, which we did to the old believers. So we have to repent of this and make peace with the old believers, and that's what led the Moscow Patriarchate to lift the anathemas against the old believers. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which at that time was highly critical of the Moscow Patriarchate, reacted and said, look, the Moscow Patriarchate lifted the anathemas against the old believers. Why aren't we doing this? How can we ever approach the old believers in Australia or America or wherever we find them if we haven't done the same? And so the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia lifted those anathemas in 1974. It was that led me to really basically lead my parishioners to do so. So it's taken a while, I think, before some of these other old believers in various areas are beginning to say, well, why not?
Hello, everyone. Would you please consider supporting me on Patreon? I'm really enjoying making this podcast as a means of having interesting conversations with people in the arts and those who are interested in promoting beauty, especially in the liturgical arts. But I'm also doing this as a means of trying to help support my family. So if you would prayerfully consider supporting me on Patreon, it would mean the world to me. The first 20 people in the United States who sign up at any financial level, be that the $5 level or above, will get a free copy of my CD, Bach's Organ Mass, recorded on the Trost organ in Waltershausen. Thank you for your support.
I just was up in Alaska last week, as a matter of fact, because one of the groups that, again, as you indicated, and I like that terminology, reunited themselves with the Russian Orthodox Church in general, asked me to come up for their parish feast and to speak to priestless old believers and old believers of their former hierarchy about why they should follow the same pattern that this church did in Alaska, and we led that lead. I don't think this is the end of it. I think particularly for two reasons, because now as these old believers have lived in America for second, third, fourth generation, number one, the young people are going, we don't understand Slavonic, and we cannot continue to have our service in Slavonic, and the Belokranitsa hierarchy is reticent to allow them to use English, so they're going, we need English. We see that Father Pimen in his parish in Erie, Pennsylvania, are not only using English, they've translated all of the books of the Russian Orthodox Church and the pre-Nikonian books into English, so they're all done, and we can use the Old Rite, and we can do it in English, but we may very well find ourselves having to follow the pattern of what happened in Erie and what happened now recently, and particularly what happened in Oregon and Alaska. So I think it's not the end of this move. I think it's probably, in many ways, the beginning of it.
Wow. As far as the priestless old believers, so they just don't have communion ever. So
That's right.
If you're a gone like hundreds of years.
Yeah, if you're a priestless old believer, and that's what led me. I grew up a priestless old believer, and I did my undergraduate work in a university called Colgate University, and I was only 30 miles away from Jordanville, New York, Holy Trinity Monastery, which is the center of spirituality of the church outside of Russia. I never once went to Jordanville my 4 years at Colgate because I was a priestless old believer, and we had nothing to do with the so-called Nikonians. But over a period of time, I began to realize it was a different situation. But if you're a priestless old believer, you basically have been taught we are doing everything correctly. It's the Nikonians, the new rite, that have really switched from everything. And if you any person who's listening to you knows Orthodox services, if you do Vespers and Matins, the differences between having a priest or not having a priest are minuscule. The difference between, even when you do the hours, they're minuscule. What happens then is when you come to the end of the hours, you come to the Typica, and then, if you are an Orthodox Christian, you go into the liturgy. If you're a priestless old believer, you go, we can't do the liturgy, we don't have priesthood, so we're going to serve a Meleben. A Meleben is like a kind of a Te Deum, or it's I'm trying to think what the Catholics call. Anyway, I don't want to spend time trying to think about this. So yes, so in 1982, I went to a conference that was held by the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, where we were still priestless, and I started going to the liturgy. And literally, when I was at those liturgies, one morning I went there and I began to cry, thinking about my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, who had lived their entire lives never partaking of the Eucharist, never having their sins totally absolved, never having been anointed with unction, never being chrismated. The next morning I went to the liturgy and I went, I'm not going to allow the youth of my parish, the children, and so forth, to go through another generation with this situation. So yes, they live their entire lives without the Eucharist and without the fullness of the Church, but tell themselves God understands and we're probably not worthy of these things in this secular, hedonistic, materialistic world that we now live in.
Wow. And of the priested Old Believers, have any of them rejoined?
Well, the only ones that have rejoined are the ones that have, I shouldn't say that. There may be some in Russia who actually have done that. I'm not sure how many of them have done that. Again, the priesthood Old Believers in many areas, Romania, Moscow, I've met the heads of the priesthood Old Believers in Moscow a few years ago. They're constantly trying to convince me to join. What are you doing with New Rite people? Why are you under them? And my answer to them is, first of all, again, there are irregularities in their hierarchy to begin with, but let's say you can justify that. I'm not saying you can, but if even they make that argument. But again, the reason particularly, having gone from being a completely closed-minded priestless Old Believer that I lived in my life until my 30s, I recognize fully now that this mentality of the priesthood Old Believers, that no other Orthodox Christians in the world have grace, in a sense, if you will. You can't pray with them, they can't pray with you, you can't partake of the sacraments of them. They're completely heretical. I've told them whenever I've been in contact with them, there's no way in the world I accept that. And I think that's a mentality that's now coming to, again, the generation, particularly I know of in Western North America. Do you really believe, as you're reading Schmemann and Meyendorff and Hopko and whatever you're reading, these books of the Orthodox Church, and you're reading them in English, and you're reading the Law of God, or you're reading Orthodox dogmatic theology, do you really believe that these people are not Orthodox Christians? Because that's what your hierarchy is teaching. So I think, that mentality, I think, is beginning to really sink in. Like, can you buy that argument? And I won't, and I can't. And I tell them whenever Old Believer hierarchies come to me, they'll say, well, you must have been stupid. You didn't know what you were doing. Why didn't you join Old Believers? No, I knew exactly what I was doing. And that's why I didn't, and that's why I won't. And I think that's the direction that's going to happen of many of the priesthood Old Believers, and even in Russia over a period of time. How can we possibly, it might be different when you didn't have the communications that we now have. With the communications you have and the things you can see and read, how am I going to look at these people that I can hear on Ancient Faith Radio or whoever, and go, oh, none of them are Orthodox.
Right. Is there any relationship between the Old Ritualists and, for example, like the Greek Old Calendarists?
No, no more than, I would put it this way. There was a significant part of the Greek Old Calendarists who were part of the Russian Church abroad when we came into the Russian Church abroad. And I would say it was the Greek Old Calendarist part of the Russian Church abroad that was more influential to me joining the church abroad, because there was still some stuff being done in the church abroad and the Moscow Patriarchate that bothered me. For example, the Moscow Patriarchate doing a lot of pouring baptism rather than immersion baptism, and the Russian church abroad having some, let's say, some irregularities in some of their services or shortcutting. So there was an admiration that I had for the Greek Old Calendarists, but there was a part of them under Father Panteleimon of Holy Transfiguration Monastery that many people, your watchers, may know. There was a scandal that went on there, and they left the church abroad. So there was an admiration for what they were doing, but I don't think I understand your point. You got Greek Old Calendarists, you got Russian Old Believers, aren't you? No, not in any kind of communion, because you're coming from two different directions. Of course, the Greek Old Calendarists, primarily, it was a calendar issue. For the Russian Old Believers, it was more a ritual, difference. But I would say this to you, and I'm going to be careful here because I know I don't want to get anti. I don't break down Orthodoxy, particularly in America, to what I would call, whether you're Russian or Serbian or Bulgarian or Carpatho-Russian, I really break it down more to what I call, forgive me because I'm going to offend some people, I break it down to what I call watered-down Orthodoxy or traditional Orthodoxy. And what I mean by that is we joined ourselves to the church outside of Russia because in the church outside of Russia, almost any place I can think of, you saw the kind of expectation of what Orthodoxy is that had always existed in traditional Orthodoxy. What I mean by that is you're not going to serve the liturgy unless you're doing the vigil the night before, or you're doing Vespers, and you're doing Matins, and you're doing the hours, and there's pre-communion prayers, and you've gone to confession, and you're keeping the fast, and you have the services. What I call watered-down Orthodoxy is, you put pews in the church and you skip half the services, and women don't have to cover their head, and you can walk in. I mean, there's a Eucharistic revival going on in Orthodoxy, which I admire. I'm glad. I don't think it was meant to be that people commune once a year or once every 10 years. But a Eucharistic revival means everybody walks in every Sunday with no preparation. It's very much what's happened in Roman Catholicism. Many of my parishioners were ex-Catholics, and especially the older ones will tell you the preparation they had for the Eucharist wasn't that far away from the preparation Orthodox people had. Now almost every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the Catholic Church just walks in and takes communion whenever they want to. So I would say we have an affinity to the Greek Old Calendars because I think the Greek Old Calendars are directed toward preservation of really traditional Orthodoxy, but we felt very comfortable in the church outside of Russia being the same way. Some of the other, and I'm not knocking this, I know the Antiochians, of course, are having tremendous success in attracting converts, and I know there are Antiochian parishes that are really very stringent on their practices. There are Greek archdiocese parishes that are, but then there are also parishes what I look at them and kind of go, if you want to be Orthodox, be Orthodox. This is kind of pretend Orthodoxy. You walk in and you've got icons, and you've got services that are bastardized so much that they're not even hardly recognizable. I mean, just to give you an example of that. Again, forgive me, I should be careful with saying this, but many years ago, I went to a place that was a significant center, let's say, of the OCA, and I went there, and they were having matins at 7:30 and breakfast at 8 o'clock. Well, you can't do matins in 25 minutes or half an hour in Orthodox Christianity. If you are, again, you've bastardized the service so much it's almost not recognizable. Now, one can make the argument, whatever the argument can be made, but I guess I'm indicating to you, as an old ritualist, I'm not a fanatic at all, but I believe traditional Orthodoxy should be followed, not let's water it down as much as we can so we can draw people in here who can say, now I'm Orthodoxy. And I'm sure particularly, Telegraph had this article recently about, it called it a tsunami of young men in America who are coming into Orthodoxy. Yes, and that's good. I'm glad to see that in part. If basically it's super right-wing people who are looking for super right-wing political aspects of Orthodoxy, that's the wrong reasons. I make that point even to the priest, Father Stephen in southwestern Missouri, where I think he's probably drawing people of that nature, that you need to be careful and not politicize the church. There's room for liberal people and there's room for conservative people, and you shouldn't get into that. So, I've gone far above your question, but I guess I'm trying to say I'm not a fanatic old believer, but I am an Orthodox Christian who believes Orthodox Christianity means a lot more than simply saying, well, we got icons and we walk in and take the Eucharist all the time, but we're not Catholics anymore.
Sure, no, that makes sense. And I mean, a lot of the Orthodox I know, I admire their piety. They're very serious about communion. They'll often not take every week. They make sure they fast before they take communion. It's definitely different than the church that I'm in. One thing I appreciate about the Orthodox, I will say, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is sort of in distinction from the Catholics. It seems like if there were a bunch of Catholic monks who said, you know what, we're no longer going to pray for our bishops, then the bishops would say, then you're out of communion with us. But in the Orthodox, there's all these monasteries on Athos who basically say, our bishops have gone totally heretical, and they just drop their name from the diptychs, and they don't pray for them. But instead of the bishops excommunicating those monasteries, they're like, well, it's probably for the best, because it's better for the church that we have people who are on a continuum of rigorism towards liberality. We need some people to hold the faith, and so it's better that those that there's even monks out there who won't pray for us because they say we're heretical. Let's just not touch them. At least that's my understanding. Is that sort of
Yeah,
correct?
I don't. If that's the case, I really don't know that because I know there was a period of time when one of those monasteries wasn't praying for the Patriarch of Constantinople some years ago, maybe 20 years ago, and I don't think he was that open-minded about that I understand. So I'm not sure that case exists.
Maybe
and
I'm
again,
totally off. Sorry.
and look, I want to make sure this is clear. I don't think there's anything wrong with people if they want to commune every week, but you have to make sure you prepare yourself properly for doing that. You just don't. I'll have people from other jurisdictions who will call me and say, Father Pimen Simon, I'm from the blah blah blah. I won't say another Orthodox church. Can I commune your church? Yes, but you have to come to the services the night before. Have you been keeping the fast days that exist, whatever they are? Have you confessed fairly recently? You need those, pre-communion prayers. If you're willing to do that, yes. And then generally they don't show up. Because in their church, very often I can just walk in on Sunday morning and, I had some Russians who walked into my church a few years ago, little Russians who walked in and they got in line for communion and they were obnoxious. A couple people told them not to, like, what are you doing? How can you possibly tell me you can't come to communion? I've never seen you before. You weren't in church last night. There's no way you can just walk up to, to the chalice. So, and just one other example, I had a man from another Orthodox jurisdiction come to me not too long ago, and it was before Great Lent began, and he said, in our church during, Great Lent, our Lenten fasting is we give up something for Lent. And I said, that's not Orthodox fasting. And sometimes my own parishioners will say, well, they, the blah, 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 they'll talk about other church. That's their fasting. No. All Orthodox have the same fasting rules. You abstain entirely from all animal products during any fast, and for strict fast, you abstain from any fish as well. So when somebody tells you that their fasting rule is you give up something for Lent or you give up meat for Lent, that's not Orthodox fasting. That's some watered-down Orthodox fasting rule. That's just not the. Well, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I don't go up to those people and say you're not Orthodox, any of that. Okay, that's your business, but that's not what traditional Orthodoxy is really about.
Sure. And then you have the Ethiopians who they're like, we're just going to eat bread and water for all of Lent.
They're very pious. I have some Eritreans. You know about this whole thing with Eritreans from the Ethiopians?
A little bit. I know there's a distinction.
Okay, so they had a political
the
thing in their country. I don't know how many years, and I don't know the story. So I've had some Eritreans who were part, again, the Ethiopian church who've come to my church. They live in Erie. They are really pious people. I couldn't agree with you more. I have this one woman during Holy Week, she puts me to shame. She'll come and ask me if the church is open, and she basically goes in the church and stands there praying for like 6 or 7 hours during the weekdays of Holy Week, when I kind of walk in and go, well, I'm not standing here 6 hours. So yeah, they're very pious people.
Indeed. So for the priestless old believers, what about the altar? Is there an altar? Or is it?
Well, let's put it this way.
Is there an iconostasis?
I get your question. I would tell you that the vast majority of priestess old believers churches do not have an altar because they were probably built after the period of time when there was no priesthood left. So there's no sense. What my church had, typical old believer church, you'd have a whole wall of icons in the front. And you had a little, like an unalloyed little stand in front of the icons where you put the gospel, and you kind of called that the altar, although it was not an altar area. If there are priestess old believers who somehow inherited a church that was a church that existed before the revolution, let's say in Russia, a really old church, you might have an altar area there, but it's not being used. So you don't use the altar area there. What we had to do when we came to priesthood in 1983, we literally had to break out the front wall of the church and then build an altar area onto the church so we would have an area, because basically you're right, priestess old believer church just have a front wall of icons.
Wow. And the Molochans, I've heard of them. Are they related to the Old Ritualists, or that's a totally different thing?
No, here's what I would say to that. Certainly there were sectarians that broke off from the Russian Orthodox Church. They all became known in Russian as Raskolniki. Raskolniki are dissenters, schismatics. So you go, well, the Molokani were schismatics and the Shakers were schismatics and the Oblate. Okay, wait a minute. I mean, you're really talking about groups that have nothing to do with real orthodoxy. So the Molokans, for example, are not Orthodox any longer, but they will be lumped and you get, well, all of these, as a matter of fact, the old believers really loved Tsar Nicholas II, although after the reforms of the Patriarch Nikon, most all believers wouldn't even pray for the czars for a period of time. But Tsar Nicholas II ended the basically the or gave freedoms to the minority religions in Russia, particularly for the Old Believers, allowed them to build churches, publish, and so forth again. Because before that time, everybody was simply a Raskolnik, a dissenter, a schismatic. And the Russian Orthodox Church and the government stopped calling them. But the Molokani, my parish actually, our choir was actually part of the Smithsonian Folk Festival in Washington that they have on the Washington Mall every year, and we were up there in 1995, and they had Molokans up there, and we kind of talked to them, but I mean, this is like a Catholic with the Assembly of God and saying, you're all this, basically you're the same. Well, you are Christians, but that's about as far as it goes.
Right. Yeah, I don't know much about them other than I've heard
well,
some of their music,
I don't know much
and
about
it
them
almost sounds like shape note music, which is very interesting. And so, and I knew they had broken off at some point. But that, talking about the choir and the Smithsonian, that's a good bridge to the Znamen chant. So what is the relationship of the old ritualists with Znamen chant? And it seemed, from my understanding, it seems like they were pretty pivotal and really instrumental in preserving the Znamen chant, because everyone else had kind of moved on to, more choral stuff, polyphonic stuff. Is that correct, or?
No, you're absolutely right. And let me expand that a little. I don't mean to go on too much, but I want to expand that. So when the Old Believers kind of drop out of Russian society and Peter the Great comes in, Peter the Great begins this westernization of the state, and the church is westernized also. And then under his daughter Elizabeth, well, under Peter it becomes kind of Protestantized, and then it becomes highly Catholic and Italian under Elizabeth, his daughter, and Catherine the Great. It becomes French. So Russian society, particularly the upper levels of Russian society and the church, became so westernized in the 18th century and the early 19th century that my basic theory on this is when Napoleon invades Russia, after that the Russians, in a sense, stop being fascinated by Western Europe, particularly by the French and so forth. Then they come to the point of going, who's the only people who really preserved much of the secular culture itself, and then the church culture, who never got into this highly polyphonic Western operatic type of music, who never got into this highly westernized iconography, who never got into this mentality of keep the first week of Lent and skip it's the Old Believers. The Old Believers became very popular in the end of the 19th century, right before the Revolution occurred. So, as to your particular question, yes, Znameni chant was the chant of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, if there's anybody who's really a scholar on this and can refute what I'm saying, I'd be glad to hear this. Basically, what I understand is most people cannot tell how closely the Znameni chant modeled itself after the Byzantine chant. The Russians get their religion from the Byzantines in 988, from their fascination with what they see in Constantinople, and for the first several hundred years they remain under the hierarchy of the church under Constantinople. I don't want to call it the Greeks alone, but under Constantinople. What I'm told by what I read about most scholars of music is there's an indication that it's very difficult to know what the Byzantine chant sounded like in that time, because the neumes, you know what I'm talking about? Right? The neumes that were being used before you had staff notation, the neumes, nobody can, I'm basically told that people cannot decipher the neumes that were used at that time. The neumes later on in the Byzantine chant changed, so what I'm trying to get at is, did the Znameni chant sound very close to the Byzantine chant? I don't know, and I'm not sure that most scholars knew. Over a period of time, there was probably at least a level of, perhaps the kind of, I don't want to call it secular music, or the music of the Slavic people that inserted itself or kind of floated into this Znameni chant. So it's really difficult for anybody to know how close was this Znamen chant to the Byzantine chant that the Russians adopted. I don't know that. If there's scholars who know it and they can tell you that's, because you're into that kind of thing, it might be interesting. I don't know. But
Well, and
nevertheless,
Father Mihaly's, in his thesis that he wrote on the Prostopenia for the Carpatho-Rusin, I will say he did take several chants, and it was very interesting because he found like the oldest versions of the same texts done in Byzantine chant notation, how they would be configured today, and then was able to compare it to the Kievan square notation, and then I think it's like the Lvov Prostopenia and then a later Prostopenia, and he was at least able to show that you could see that there were at least like pivot points that were the same going all the way back to the Byzantine. So it's obvious that the Znamen is at least related and still has some relationship to the Byzantine, but.
Well, even further than that, my late Bishop Daniel, who was one of the most brilliant men I ever knew and knew every kind of chant you can possibly imagine, he told me one time that, there was a song we sing, it's from the 17th Cathedral, we sing in Matins. In Russian it goes like this: Prisri nam ya, ye pomilуй меня, look upon me, and hearken. I forget what and have mercy on me. He said that melody sounded very close to what he knew from the Arabic of Holy God. So there's an aspect here that goes, and I would say that's really true. People who come from what I call high Russian churches, what I call whether it's in Paris or it's in Moscow or it's in New York, this kind of really high polyphony, kind of semi-operatic Tchaikovsky type of music for the church. If they come into my church and hear this Znamen, most of them hate it. It's too Arabic sounding to them. If they come from Byzantine chant or other chant, they come in and say, I really love the chant. So there's no doubt in my mind that if one goes back and says, what did the singing sound like in the Russian Orthodox Church? I don't know if you can go back to 988 or 1000, but probably 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, it was this Znamen chant, and there's very little differences. In fact, what I tell people is if you come to an Old Rite Church, I would rather call it an Old Rite Church, if you come to an Old Rite Church and you see some idiosyncrasies that you're not used to, and you come from a Russian background, OCA or Moscow Patriarch, or whatever the case might be, or Carpatho-Russian even, although there's a southern part of that, if you see some idiosyncrasies, I can tell you very clearly that probably what you're seeing is something that was more ancient. And when I say more ancient, I'm not going to tell you 300, 500, 1100, 1200. This is probably the way things look. I'll give you one example of that, Dwight. We use what's called a podruchnik. A podruchnik is something you put under your hands when you make prostrations to the floor. The purpose of doing that was keeping your hands clean when you made prostrations. All old ritualists throughout the world, if you go to them, you'll see that they're using those. Orthodox people come in and go, what is that? Why are you doing that? I will say to them, okay, I understand you're not using them, but I guarantee you this is something that's a more ancient practice. You just lost this over a period of time. The two-fingered sign of the cross is a more ancient sign of the sign of the cross. Anyone who really is scholarly and does their work will know that's the case. That's not to say that the three-fingered sign of the cross is heretical, which many old believers claim. So the Znamen chant is really quite old and quite ancient. I don't know whether one can say, if you came into Russia in 988 and you heard Father Pimen's church in the Slavonic, or they adapted English in 2025, would say, oh my gosh, it's exactly the same. But one of the things that I do with people, in fact, I just up to into Alaska, I will take them books that we have that are from the 17th century and say, okay, here's the Slavonic, the way it looks. Here's the notation, the nuums in that notation. Now I want you to hear the adapted. We're doing it in English, and you're going to see that basically we tried very hard to adapt it exactly the way it was in the Slavonic. I'll just give you an example of that. Just an example of that is the way we would sing Christos Voskres, Christ is risen here. It would sound like this in Slavonic. Христос воскресе из мертвых, смерть сия на смерть наступи, и гробным живо отдарова. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Now I could take more elaborate melodies that we tried very hard, the cherubic hymn and so forth, and try to do that and say, here I can show you the notation, and I can show you the notation as we've done it in English, and we've adapted in that manner. But this nominee chant is still recognized. My late Bishop Daniel, again, who was not born an old believer, he was born in the New Rite, but he really loved the Old Rite and then came into it fully. He used to say to people all the time, I want you to know that the official music of the Russian Orthodox Church to this day is nominee chant. It is official. And I would also say this to you, I get calls and letters and emails from all over the world to people going, Father Pimen, can you teach us nominee chant? We want to adapt nominee. OCA churches, other churches that want to get into this nominee. So there's a recognition. And why? I mean, let me just say this so I don't forget to say this to you. Clearly, in liturgical services, singing or chanting was meant to give some beauty, like, Dostoevsky says, beauty will save the world. It was not, the melodies were not meant to overwhelm the word. They were to be a background that would certainly be pleasing, but not when you came out going, the singing, the choir was so beautiful. No, did you understand what the words were? So Znameni chant, any Byzantine chant, Gregorian chant, they fit into the idea of providing a melodic background, but as you listen to it, primarily what are you hearing? The words. Not that you end up, and what I like to give the example is, I love Handel's Messiah. I mean, I think it's absolutely magnificent. But I challenge anybody who listens to Handel's Messiah for the first time, if they don't have the lyrics in front of them, to tell me, what are you singing? The music overwhelms that aspect. So when it comes to chant, even for myself, I have no problems, for example, of the Kievan chant, but some of what I would call the operatic chant, it's not even chant, the operatic singing that goes on in much of the Russian Orthodox Church it is so operatic that in an event, it's like you're not even hardly listening to the words, and especially if you continue in Slavonic and you don't understand Slavonic, which the vast majority of Russian Orthodox don't understand Slavonic, you're really more interested in having a beautiful choir entertain you with this beautiful singing rather than hear the precious words of the Stihadian or the Yidmos that's being sung.
So y'all are totally opposed to harmony.
We don't use it at all. We've never used it, and I don't think any old ritualists have ever used it. There's no harmony at all. Okay. And when we adapted, and we've adapted 90% or so of all the singing from the Slavonic, we've done it all in this nominee chant. And I want to say to you, my bishop, again, my late Bishop Daniel, this goes back to the beginning of our conversation. He said to me when we came into priesthood and we came in England, he said to me specifically, he said to me, because I told him I really like Byzantine chant, he said, if you want to use Byzantine chant or some other chant, go somewhere else. Your forefathers died to preserve this aspect, and if you start monkeying around and introduce other things in the church, other old believers are going to look at you and say, you see what happened? The Nikonians influence them and they start using that other stuff. That's what always was going to happen. So do not do that in any fashion, and we haven't. No, there's no harmony at all. Let me make one other point to that. One of the my late bishop, again, forgive me, he would say to people all the time, look, the Old Rite and the New Rite are not different rites. They're just variations of the same rite. If you were to say to me, what's the primary difference between going to an Old Rite Church and a New Rite Church, particularly a Russian Orthodox Church? What I would tell you is, in the Old Rite it says, this is what you do, and you do. In the New Rite it says, this is what you do, and you go, well, but we can skip some of this. So it's a matter of discernment of going a different direction. And the other thing you'll notice is the music is just so different, depending. Again, any of your listeners, if they go to Jordanville, I don't think you go, well, that's a whole different world of singing. But if you go to, I've watched Christ the Savior Cathedral out of Moscow with the Patriarchal Church. I remember one year watching Great Compline on Christmas Eve, and I was watching part of it, it was afterward, it wasn't Christmas Eve, and we were in services, but literally going, I don't have any idea what they were doing. I didn't even recognize any of that singing. So the music that ended up coming into being, when I watch Christ the Savior Cathedral and they've got a choir up in the loft and the men have tuxedos on and the women have long gowns on and they're putting on a performance of music that's so far removed from the Znameni chant. It's a whole different world. That's what Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff and that sound to me. Whether or not he actually used the now, in fairness, I remember, who was it? One of them, whoever did the Easter Overture. I can't remember. It was Mussorgsky or it wasn't Tchaikovsky, but whoever did that one, I can't remember. Any event, I remember listening to that one time and going, "Oh, I can really hear the melodies of Christ is Risen in there." So I can hear that. So I remember that one particularly, the Easter Overture, which I'm forgetting which was one of those the major composers. Maybe it was Rimsky. I think it was Rimsky-Korsakov. I should have forgot. I haven't taught there for 10
years.
I
think he quotes the Paschal Stachyrron in it.
Yeah, and you could certainly hear that. So yes, there are origins, but eventually what ended up happening, and I know when I get off track on that, is I remember one time, again, I won't say where because I don't want to get myself in trouble, but let's say it was in one of the really high cathedrals of the Russian Church outside of Russia, and at the end of the Vespers part, they were singing, "Lord, now let us thy servant depart in peace," and it was so operatic, and it went on for so long that I went, well, if you didn't sing this long operatic piece, you wouldn't have to go skipping other parts of the services. So, there are really, for an old ritualist to go into some places, I don't mean all of them, but to go into some places, what we would call the Russian New Rite, like Christ the Savior Cathedral, it's almost like, oh my gosh, I'm in a different world here. I don't even recognize what you're doing. Because the singing is so different. In fact,
yeah, it's a totally different.
First time we went to the Holy Land, we took 4 pilgrimages. We were in the Holy Land in 1981 when we were still priestless, and one of my younger parishioners, who's now my 3rd priest, he was standing with me during the vigil, and they were singing "Lord, I Have Cried," and very beautiful. The nuns were really beautiful in the Ascension Convent. But I said to him, "Do you know what they're singing?" And he said, "No." I said, "Well, really listen very carefully. You'll hear the singing Господи возвал, which is Lord, I have cried." And they went, "Oh, yeah, they are." But the singing was so different. So for most people who really like that kind of music, I'm not talking like the Carpatho-Russian or plain chant, but for those who really like that, they come into my church and I know, I mean, they may not say it to me, but I know a lot of them like, I really didn't like that singing.
I didn't realize that Solzhenitsyn was so pivotal.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, since you raised that, he even came to one of our old priestess, old believer churches in New Jersey, the place called Millville, New Jersey, about 40 miles away from Philadelphia, one of our centers of our old believers who came from Suwałki, Poland. And he came there, I think, clearly with the idea that he wanted to really encourage this kind of end to this long schism. Unfortunately, my former nastavnik, my mentor who had retired and gone there, I think he saw Solzhenitsyn's visit not so much as an attempt to reconciliation, but as in a sense of a sign of triumphalism. You see, Solzhenitsyn has come to us. He recognizes that we're the real Orthodox. And so I think Solzhenitsyn kind of after that went, okay, that's not what I was after. But no, Solzhenitsyn, I would tell you right now, I've been able to get connections, I would tell you right now that probably there's no doubt in my mind that after 42 years ago since we came to priesthood, I don't know that it would have ever happened, let's say, if it's not for Solzhenitsyn, who really pushes the Moscow Patriarchate when then the church abroad. I don't think I would have come to priesthood if those anathemas and curses still existed against the old belief. I feel like I can pretty much say I wouldn't have.
That's incredible.
So Solzhenitsyn, I guess I should pray for Solzhenitsyn every night.
And it does raise an interesting sort of not analogy, but maybe like an example to look to. So, I mean, granted, this is, very speculative, but there's all these ecumenical dialogues between the non-Chalcedonian churches and the Chalcedonian churches. And it seems to me, I could be wrong, but there's often been reports where they've been able to come to like the same conclusion where they're almost there, where for example, the Coptics have been able to like rephrase their Christology and their Miaphysitism in a way that was reconcilable with the diaphysitism of like the Greeks and the Russians, for example. But it does seem like even if they could come to the point where they say, yes, we believe the same faith, you have the issue of all of the anathemas that have been made against people like Severus and Dioscorus, who they consider saints, and yet the Orthodox consider heretics. And so then the question is, what do you do about that? And so, I mean, I don't know if removing the anathemas is possible, or if that itself would, be considered anathema. You can't remove the anathema against Dioscorus, but, what do you see in that? Because you're in a pretty unique situation. Could that be an example for the rest of the Orthodox world to look to as they, dialogue, at least the super old, non-Chalcedonian
Well, I don't think
Orthodox?
there's any question about that. And I think the tragedy in Christianity is, I think if we had the communications we have now, I'm not sure we would even have a split in the Christian church. Would we really have had a split on the filioque clause if you had people doing what we're doing right now? I mean, I think that they probably would have talked it out. And just to your very point, I think you'll find this fascinating. Again, we have a number of these Eritreans who come from the Ethiopian church who start coming to my church, and I made this point to them: you need to understand the idea of Monophysites and Chalcedonians. And I went to one of those. He invited me over to his house for dinner one day, one of these Eritreans. So we're sitting there, and he goes, "Well, he says this to me. He says the difference between us and you," he says to me, "you don't believe in the two natures of Christ." And I went, "What?" He said, well, "We believe that there are two natures, the divine and human, fully divine." And I'm going, "No, we believe that. I've always been led to believe you don't believe that." He said, "Oh, and of course we believe that." So you're right. This little nuance somewhere along the line there, exactly what you're talking about. And the funny thing was, a good number of I'll sometimes have like 25 of these Eritreans come to my church on a weekend, and when we're celebrating the Sunday of the Holy Fathers and we start singing, particularly a couple of us ahead, and talking about the idea of, you refuted the teachings of Dioscorus and Severus and so forth, and these Eritreans are standing there, I'm not sure they pick it up going, "We're calling the people you think saints heretics." So, are you getting this? Are you going to walk out on us? So you're absolutely right. I mean, and that's a good point. I mean, it may sound stupid what I said before, but how could I have joined myself to a church that was basically saying the Old Rite and the Old Ritualists are all heretics? We're not heretics any more than you have to understand the Old Believers call the New Rite heretics. You play with the three-finger sign of the cross, you're a heretic. No, that's not heresy. Of course, people come to the idea of ignorance and lack of education where you can't tell the difference between ritual and dogma. But even if you get into dogmatic questions, a lot of time it's such slight nuances, and then you start throwing these anathemas around, and again, there's no way to even be able to communicate with one another. I completely agree with what you just said.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like you'd have to drop some of the anathemas in order to reconcile the communions, but I don't know.
And and thank God, I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church did, and literally in their decree in 1974, as the Moscow Patriarchate, literally dropped the anathemas and said the Old Rite is orthodox and saving. Okay, now I'll listen to you.
Right.
Now I'll listen to you. And again, I would advise anybody who has listened to this, who has any interest, go read the book that's called Russia, Ritual, and Reform. It's by Paul Meyendorff, who was John Meyendorff, a really well-known theologian of the OCA. Paul Meyendorff wrote this book, and he really goes into the background of how the schism occurred. He blames the Tsar much more than he blames the Patriarch, but then he even goes into the ritualistic reforms, and it's the only book really written in the English language that's really objective, that's not subjective. In fact, even in Russian, almost everything's subjective. This Old Believers throw all kinds of heretic things at the New Rite, and the New Rite throws the same thing at the Old Believers. But Meyendorff did a really scholarly work on this, and what he comes to the conclusion, and I've studied this, and if I have an expertise on anything, it's this. He comes to the conclusion that, in fact, the reforms of the Patriarch Nikon were not made on the ancient Greek manuscripts, which they were supposed to. They were primarily made on books that were published in Venice in 1596 that certainly had Latin influence and certainly had Western influence in them. So he makes the determination in the end that most of these reforms were based on westernized, Latinized practices, and that the vast majority of the things the old believers were indicating were more ancient. You see, because the reason the so-called justification, the Russians under the Mongol yoke under 200 years has somehow become isolated and just start inserting all kind of errors in their liturgical worship. Meyendorff's thing, and the old believers and really scholarly people will tell you that's not true. It really wasn't true. These were more ancient practices. Patriarch Nikon did them because the other Orthodox was saying, in a sense, we really need to offset the power of the Pope. We really need an organized Orthodox, let's say, a front. And the only boy on the block who are big enough and or in a sense isolated, independent enough, not under either Turkish influence or Latin influence, or you Russians, but you Russians are doing some things differently than us. So why don't you correct your things and make them like ours?
And what other liturgical things are like relatively different from those who are on the new rite? Like, for example, do y'all prostrate on Sundays?
Well, okay, then you raise an interesting question. I'm kind of glad to address that. I'll address it in this manner. We make some, very few, but almost any Orthodox who says you can't make prostrations on Sunday, first of all, anybody who's there on the third Sunday of Lent when you're having the veneration of the cross and singing, "Before thy cross we bow down, Christ ut foima proclaim," so are you. I don't know anybody who's not. So there's got to be a reason there, and this is what I want to bring out. In the pre-Nikonian Triot, what is the Paschal, we call it the Triot, the Pentecostarian, it's called for other Orthodox churches. In that book, at the end of the Paschal canon, at the end of singing "Shine, Shine, New Jerusalem, Svetissa, Svetissa," if you have people who know Slavonic, it says that you make a prostration niprimena, which means without exception. Then a page later it says you don't pray on bended knees during the Paschal season. You see, I have a real theory about this, and I think I'm correct on this. What the Church Fathers were really talking about, especially after the First Ecumenical Council, is we don't pray on bended knees on Sundays and during the Paschal season. In the early church, I'm sure that much of the prayer was done not even on kneeling, as we would think kneeling, but really prostrate on bended knees. Don't do that on Sundays and holidays. We pray standing. But there are certain places where you would never not make a prostration itself, but you don't pray on bended knees. And a good example, if somebody would doubt the veracity of what I'm saying, is what do we do immediately on Pentecost as soon as we finish the liturgy? We do the Vespers, and what do? You get back down on bended knees because the Paschal season has ended, and now we pray on bended knees again, the normal way of praying. So we may make a few prostrations on Sundays, but so do other Orthodox, particularly when they're doing "Before Thy Cross." But very few of them. The vast majority of prostrations you find on weekdays, and during the weekdays of Lent, Great Lent, we make hundreds of prostrations in the services. I mean, if the one were to say what's the most rigor in the Old Rite, on the great canon, for example, of Andrew of Crete on the fifth Thursday of Lent, we are to make 3 prostrations on every tropodion that's read, meaning, I think it says at the end of the canon, we have 797 prostrations that are made during the service. So there's a lot of prostration. What I would tell you is another interesting aspect, that much of the argument between the reforms of the Patriarch Nikon and the Old Rite disappear in English. Because you see, there were little things like this. Again, if you have somebody who understands your Slavonic, in the Old Rite, on Now and Ever into the Ages, it goes, "Inine I prisno I vove kive kom amin." In the New Rite it became "Inine I prisno I vekov amin." Jesus was in the Old Rite Isus. In the New Rite it became Isus. And these became major areas they argued about. Well, when you come into the English, they disappear. Jesus is Jesus. Now and ever into the ages of ages is now and ever into the ages of ages. So a good
Although
part
I do
of that,
prefer the KJV, "As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen."
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
just
I understand
more
that.
flowery.
So, I mean,
but yeah, I get it.
I
Now
would
and
tell
ever
you,
into the-
if somebody were to say to me, tell me 2 or 3 things that are significantly different if I went to an Old Rite church. That is, you probably find the services longer because the services are done intact. Number 2, the singing is different unless you've used chant. And I don't know, there's not much else that's really different. I mean, they are the same
How long
service.
would the service be?
Let's say if we did a vigil in the Old Rite, normally you're going to talk about a vigil being at least 4 hours. I know,
Wow.
there are churches that will tell me they've done, I know somebody tell me there was, I don't know what jurisdiction it was, they did the vigil and they did it in an hour and 45 minutes or 2 hours or something of that nature. That's really what you would find to be the significant difference. It
And
is
a
the same.
typical
So
liturgy?
I'm going to combine hours with that. If you take hours combined with the liturgy, about two
Okay.
hours, we
So
can get done with
relatively
that.
the same
Yeah,
as
no,
like what I would
because
have seen in an OCA church.
who's gonna go changing the liturgy? I mean, really, you really have to tamper with the liturgy. The only thing I would think that a lot of churches probably tamper with, they get rid of the litany of the catechumens and so forth. But you're not going to have the audacity to go changing the liturgy. And one of the things, Dwight, just as an example, what I'm saying, I was able to. I won't say convince. I told Metropolitan Nicholas, the Metropolitan of the Church Abroad, about a year ago. We published one of our last major publications, that is the Festal Manean, with
Mm.
57 different services in it, and I basically got him to give an introduction telling all all members of the church outside of Russia, New Rite and Old Rite, had the permission to use that book because I told him 99% of the way it is in the Old Rite is 99% of that is the same in the New Rite. There's almost no differences between the Festal Manean and the Festal Manean and the New Rite. There's very little differences. It was really a bunch of small differences, and particularly it was really about the sign of the cross.
Okay. And then wasn't processions as well? Wasn't there a
Procession, yeah. I
difference?
mean, yes, processions.
Yeah.
Either we go with the sun, they go opposite the sun. But again, I don't think most people made a huge difference about that. If it hadn't been the sign of the cross, I'm not sure this would have ever happened.
But the calendar is the same.
Calendar's the same. Yeah.
Okay. Because in a lot of Russian, this I definitely don't understand, but it's, I don't know, where a lot of Russian churches do Epiphany on a totally different day, but then oftentimes Epiphany is the same day in OCA churches as it would be for like
Yeah.
Catholic churches.
Well, here's what I can say. I mean, you understand the old calendar, new calendar. So many Orthodox,
It's
particularly the OCA,
Julian
the
versus Gregorian,
and
right?
they like to call it the revised Julian, but it's basically still the same Gregorian calendar. So it's particularly the OCA, in America at least, have gone had well, so the Greek archdioceses have gone on the Gregorian calendar. So okay, so it's theophany for those Orthodox on the new calendar on January 6th, using the
Mm-hmm.
Gregorian calendar, and for us it's Christmas Eve. And I would say to you that I think if I'm a person looking at Orthodoxy, and someone were to say to me, "What's nuts about those Orthodox people?" I would say what's nuts is we have the Orthodox Church claiming to be one church and we're on two different calendars. That's a
Mm.
tragedy to me. You can go in a town in eastern Pennsylvania and say 5 blocks away is an OCA church and they're on the new calendar and they're celebrating Theophany or Epiphany, and you're on the old calendar 5 blocks away celebrating Christmas Eve, but you're Orthodox. So I mean, I agree that that's probably and I don't think there's an answer to that. And I don't think there's an answer to it because I think the vast majority of the Russian Orthodox people, I mean, if who are the vast majority of Orthodox people in this world? It's still the Russian Orthodox by far. In Russia, it doesn't matter to them. I don't have any problem not celebrating Christmas on December 25th with the Catholics and the Protestants. They're such a small part of our society. For the most part, Orthodox Christians in America and Constantinople, wherever else they introduced the new calendar, they did it because of Christmas. Everybody else is celebrating Christmas and we're still in the middle of the Nativity fast. Let's go on the same calendar. That's really why it was. And for the Russians, what do I care? And again, part of the problem we have is in America, we are in an infinitesimal minority. We are in an infinitesimal minority. So there is that whole aspect that you have to kind of go. And what I try to tell people is one of the good things that happened to me when I was in law school, I went to University of Pittsburgh School of Law. I lived in Squirrel Hill, which is a highly Jewish area. And living in Squirrel Hill, I saw the fervency of these Jewish people with the practices they had. I don't care if I'm in America or not. This is what we do. Saturdays, Saturday. I'll give you one example of that. I got off a bus from where the University of Pittsburgh was in an area called Oakland. My first year of law school, my wife and I got married later, and I didn't have a car, and I got off, and I had no idea it was Rosh Hashanah, and it was Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and it was a Monday, and I went to go to the stores, and the stores were all closed, and I had no idea, and I went up to some guy and said, "Why are the stores closed? It's Monday." He goes, "It's Rosh Hashanah. What, you don't know it's Rosh Hashanah?" Like, okay, you close the stores on Rosh Hashanah? Yeah, they do. So my point is, the Jews are in a minority too, and they go, we can live with that. So I mean, for Orthodox people, we are in a minority. You have to swim upstream to some extent, but the old calendar forces you more to swim upstream, particularly at Christmas. That's really what it's about. Who care? Really, who cares if you have transfiguration on a different day, or who care? Because I just gave this sermon in my church yesterday and said it's really interesting, particularly the transfiguration which you celebrated last week, because I really doubt if you went up to most Catholics, they would have the slightest idea this is the transfiguration. So if you're looking at it saying, well, all of our feast days are celebrated together with the Catholics now, they don't even know what most of their feast days are. I'm not even sure the vast majority of them even know it was the Dormition last week or the week before.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, great. You answered a ton of my questions. Is there anything that I've missed that you would say?
And went further than you asked on some other things. So I apologize.
No, that's perfect. No, that's perfect. It's all very fascinating to me, and it's great to get some more clarification on, some of the distinctions, because, I've heard about priestless and priested old believers. I didn't know there were two different types of old believers before a couple months ago, but.
For you and anybody else, I really would recommend, if somebody said, I found this interesting, go to our website, because we have a lot of this background of the history of the old believers, the schism, even the differences. It is churchofthenativity.net. That's all one word, churchofthenativity.net. That's all one word. Go to there and you'll see lots of information about all the things we talked about.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much. And I want to ask about one person that I think is in your parish. Is Father Theodore Urevitz in your parish?
Yes, he's famous iconographer. Father Theodore Urevitz is a wonderful, wonderful iconographer. He's not painting as much now, but he painted many churches throughout the country, in Serbian churches, OCA churches. Yes, he's a noted iconographer. Yes, he became my second priest many years ago, and he did it. He was a rector of a parish, a New Rite parish in Cleveland, but he had 10 children. Needed to support his children by painting icons, said, I really would like I should be a second priest. I went, we could use a second priest. And he really liked the Old Rite, and so it was a marriage made in heaven. But yeah, he's been
So was he always Old Rite, or he was just Old Rite? Like, was he Old Rite before he was a New Rite priest?
No,
oh, okay.
He was not. He just came to really love the Old Rite. And I would indicate to you, we have lots of pictures, I think, on our website. I mean, he painted every space of our church. The walls are filled with murals of Christ-related things, because the Church of the Nativity and the icons.
Yeah, I've seen some of them. They're remarkable.
I had a guy who walked into my church who was looking at fixing a floor in our church this morning, who walked in and said, oh my gosh, our church is very visible. It has gold domes overlooking the bay here in Lake Erie. And the guy walked in and said, I've seen your church so many times, never been inside. My gosh, it's the most beautiful church in Erie. So people generally are awestruck, and that's Father Theodore's icons.
Wow. Yeah, I would love to speak with him. I know he's done some Coptic iconography, evidently. Which
I think he did. I think you're right. I think he did.
It'd be interesting to see how someone who's from the Russian tradition approached Coptic iconography, plus his own style of iconography, if it's different for old believers versus new believers. I mean, there's lots of interesting questions there.
I mean, that I would say it isn't. Anybody who tells you it's an old believer icon, there aren't. If you look at really good iconographers, and the vast majority of iconographers have stopped painting these really westernized icon. I'll give you a little story of that before we get off. Because I taught for so many years, people knew I taught Russian and so forth, so people would come up to me and say, Father, I went to Russia. That's really nice. I went to Petersburg. Great. I went to St. Isaac's Cathedral. Do you know what I'm talking about, St. Isaac's? St. Isaac's is a huge, wonderful building, but it could be St. Peter's Cathedral. It looks like a Roman Catholic thing. And I went inside and I saw the beautiful icons. Well, then at that point I have to choke and kind of go, let me not start to choke on this idea, because the iconography is horrible. I mean, it's horrible if you know iconography. If you think all that Latinized Western romantic mushy iconography is iconography, then you love it. But if you know iconography, so there is no old believer iconography. The iconography, the old believers never got into that, and I think people then began to look. For example, you'd have some people, if you know anything about icons, Pimen Simon, who is also a priestess old believer. His icons he's a rather famous iconographer, and he painted many non-old believer churches throughout the country. So there is no such thing as old believer iconography. There's simply traditional icon. If one looks at the very famous Rublev Old Testament Trinity and Father Theodore's Old Testament Trinity, you go, okay, they look basically the same thing. That's true iconography.
Sure. Yeah. Anyway, well, thanks for talking with me today. I really appreciate it.